Steve, thank you so much for that nice introduction. When I applied to be a snowplow driver for MoDOT, she said, "You'll never work out. Those people drive fast and you drive too slow." Well, everybody's got to stay busy doing something. So I am now a certified part-time snow chasing snowplow driver for MoDOT, and I happen to love it. But we're not here to talk about that this evening, but I do appreciate the kind invitation. And looking around the room, I thought surely, with the fog and the weather, we did luck out this evening, so to speak, but I really didn't expect this size of crowd. And then when I walked in and saw everybody gathering, I realized it, and I hate to disappoint you, but I'm sure you're here to watch the New Hampshire primary. I think that's in the next room. So don't everybody leave right all at once. But it is a pleasure to be with you this evening and to see a lot of nice, friendly faces, some people I haven't seen for a long time. And as Steve mentioned, I'm going to talk about Franklin Island and Davisdale, which is a big part of my family. What I didn't know when I came here this evening, and I've got some prepared remarks, and by the way, my presentation is going to last about 45 minutes. So if you have babysitters that'll be waiting for you, maybe an hour, but hopefully no longer than that. When I walked in this evening, I thought, well, I'll know some people. Tim and Linda Harlan come in and sit down at our table. Tim and I are classmates. We've known each other for probably 70 years. The reason I mentioned Tim and Linda, good friends, I didn't know till this evening when he said, by the way, his great-grandfather owned Franklin Island back in the early 1900s. I've known Tim for 70 years. He's known that we were involved with Franklin Island. We've never talked about that till this evening. What a thrill, Tim. Thank you. Well, it gets better. A very nice lady comes up to me and says, I know you're busy getting ready, but I have to introduce myself. And by the way, I've got some family here. And the lovely lady's name is Tam. And she said, parents, right? Is that correct, Tam? She said, my parents, Doug and Abby Thomas, if you all would just stand up, please. I haven't seen these folks for 50 years. The reason I mention them, it's so great to have you folks here, is when I talk about Franklin Island, Doug's parents were the first people in my family to be associated with Franklin Island. And what a thrill to see you folks. So now I've got several people that can keep me honest this evening. Debbie promised that she would not embarrass me, but now I've got several people who know whether I'm telling it like it is or not. But anyway, it's great to be here. I have some prepared remarks, so I don't really have it memorized. I don't mean to bore you, but there's a lot of information here, and I think you'll enjoy it. Well, I have a somewhat of a unique perspective on Franklin Island and Davisdale. My family, the Davis family, owned these properties for over 50 years prior to their acquisition by the Department of Conservation, also known as MDC. And this evening, I'll share some background on the department's design for conservation and the resulting tax-based program that has provided funding for the design for nearly 50 years. I'll also share some history with you about Franklin Island and Davisdale. And finally, I'd like to tell you some Missouri River history, basically about commercial navigation and about a warehouse business on the banks of the Missouri River that my family also owned for over 35 years. And by the way, I'd like to keep this very informal. So if at any time you'd like me to stop to take another look at the slide or ask me a question, please feel free to do so. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to have the opportunity for questions. And David mentioned to me that Steve and maybe David or someone will have a couple of microphones. So they'll walk around the room, and if you have a question, you can talk into the microphone. And for folks who, like me, are audibly challenged or whatever, can't hear very well, if you ask me a question, I'll repeat the question so everybody can hear. So this photograph, can anyone tell me where that is? There's a prize. I saved the prize. We can have that cupcake ourselves later. I took this photograph about 3 years ago, Fort Benton, Montana. I'm standing on the old Fort Benton Bridge, which was built in 1888. It was the first steel structure bridge across the Missouri River in Montana. And as you may know, back in the navigation days before the dams and reservoirs, Fort Benton was the head of navigation on the Missouri River. You go on upstream from Fort Benton, you get to Great Falls. If you know your Lewis and Clark history, they had to portage around the Great Falls. So Fort Benton, lovely place, was the head of navigation. And this bridge is now on the National Historic Register, National Register of Historic Places. It was in operation until 1962 when they built a more modern bridge. And so it was in business from 1888 to 1962. So Debbie and I were there a few years ago because we love exploring sites along the Missouri River. Every year we take our camper and we're on the road for 2 or 3 months in the summer. And this was really a highlight for us as we worked our way up the Missouri River. Another thing I had the pleasure of this particular 2023, I've always been fascinated by the headwaters of the Missouri River, where 3 rivers come together to form the Missouri River. Well, we visited that location at Three Forks, as it's called, and I had the pleasure of spending a couple of hours fly fishing on 2 out of 3 of the rivers that form the headwaters of the Missouri River. We don't have a lot of trout in the Missouri River down here, but it's beautiful country up there for those of you who have been to Montana. Good to go. So I mentioned that I'd like to talk a little bit about the Missouri Department of Conservation design for conservation. This program began in the late 1960s with a study by MDC to evaluate its fisheries, forestry, and wildlife management policies, and to plan a course of action for the future. The year-long Leopold study concluded that MDC was doing an excellent job for hunters and fishermen, but there was much room for improvement in providing opportunities for others to use and enjoy Missouri's outdoor resources. Can everyone hear me okay, by the way? All right. Well, the study's recommendation and vision for the future included the following: forming partnerships with landowners for the future, landowners, farmers, and schools, more opportunities and places for all to enjoy Missouri outdoors, including large-scale acquisition of land for recreation and habitat, clean waterways, beautiful scenery, healthy, sustainable ecosystems. And finally, management based on scientific data and habitat protection. All these things that we're very interested in, and their foresight 50, 60 years ago could see the need. Well, it was agreed that the Conservation Commission had an obligation to provide and manage areas for everyone, not just for hunters and fishermen. But new sources of funding would be needed to acquire, develop, and maintain the areas. The price tag of the new programs at that time, again, we're talking 50 years ago, was estimated at $21 million, probably be 50 million today at least, and the money was not there. Well, at the time, people, of course, were already using conservation areas for other activities besides hunting and fishing, but they were paying nothing for the privilege. So in 1970, a Citizens Commission for Conservation, which was chaired by Ted Scott of Buffalo, Missouri, this commission was formed to study the potential sources of revenue for conservation. A petition drive was initiated in July of 1975 with a proposed source of funding of a 1/8 cent sales tax, general sales tax, for conservation. The campaign for the ballot issue was spearheaded by the Conservation Federation of Missouri. Some of you may be familiar with that organization. It's still going strong. Under the leadership of Executive Director Ed Stegner, who just happened to be a Cooper County native where Debbie and I live. By the way, that's my lovely wife, Debbie Davis, over there. Thank you for joining us. So over 200,000 signatures were collected for this ballot issue, and the issue was placed on the November 1976 ballot. The ballot issue passed by a 51 to 49% squeaker margin. Missouri voters had shown the foresight and willingness to tax themselves to protect Missouri's resources for their children and grandchildren. Well, the results have been spectacular. Missouri's conservation program is a national model, and all of us have more places and more ways to enjoy the outdoors as a result. You know, the 8-cent conservation sales tax has endured for nearly 50 years and still provides funding for Missouri's outstanding conservation programs. In recent years, as you may know, some legislators have made proposals to eliminate or reduce the tax, even though the overwhelming majority of citizens are pleased with the accomplishments of MDC. And our conservation areas and fish and wildlife management programs are a huge economic resource for the state. MDC manages more than this really astounded me, more than 1,000 conservation areas of various sizes. I talked to MDC a couple of days ago and I said, that's a misprint. He said, no, it's 1,000 areas, various sizes, some very small. And it totals nearly 1 million acres. And just to put that in perspective, there's about 446 million acres in the state of Missouri. So gives you an idea of the scale. And of those 1 million acres that MDC manages or owns, MDC owns outright about 824,000 acres. And approximately 510,000 of those acres have been purchased since 1976, when the sales tax was put in place. In 2021, the average Missourian paid about $19 annually in sales tax that not only supports conservation efforts, but provides the department's primary source of funding. Primary. According to MDC's fiscal year 2021 budget request, the sales tax provided 62% of MDC's revenue in fiscal year 2019. About 17% came from fishing and hunting permit sales, federal reimbursements, another 15%, and the remaining 6% from other sources. The good news for us is that MDC receives no funds from the state's general revenue fund. Therefore, the revenue generated from the dedicated sales tax has allowed the Conservation Department to be responsive to the needs of Missouri citizens and the state's natural resources by offering a wide variety of services to general, non-hunting, and angling populations through urban nature centers, education and outdoor skills specialists, and extensive private land technical assistance. The Sales Tax and constitutionally established Conservation Commission have been instrumental in the success of the Missouri model of managing fish, forest, and wildlife resources. And again, don't hesitate to stop me if you have questions. So Steve asked earlier who has been to a speaker series before. Now I'd like to see if any of you in this room, show of hands, have been to either Franklin Island or Davisdale Wildlife. Oh my gosh. Well, I'll go ahead and sit down. Somebody else can talk about it. Okay, so if any of you have not been there, here's the town of Boonville. There's Franklin Island, and there's Davisdale Conservation Area. Of course, Franklin Island is in the floodplain, and Davisdale Conservation Area is in the upland area. Of course. I'll just repeat the question. So she asked a very good question. She's seen the signs on the highway driven by, but it's hard to tell from the sign what there is to do there. Of course, they're conservation areas or wildlife areas. And one thing that I encourage people to do is to go on the MDC's website for maps and descriptions. There's everything. Franklin Island basically is management for, it's a good deer habitat, turkey habitat. It's all wild. There's no improvements. Davisdale has, I think, 23 ponds, hiking trails, forest, open fields. They're just lovely conservation areas for wildlife management. And an interesting thing is that when, getting a little bit off the track, but before I forget, when MDC bought Franklin Island, their intention was to turn it into a wetland refuge. Anybody here from MDC? Well, my father said, okay, Jim, how are you? Another guy to keep me honest here this evening. But this is kind of a fun story. So my dad said to Department of Conservation, so you want to turn it into a wetland refuge? That's right. My dad said, well, I'm happy to sell it to you, but I got to tell you, we've been working for 50 years to drain that farm. They said, don't worry about it. Okay. Well, that's another story for another day. Well, MDC purchased the roughly 1,300 acre Franklin Island from Davisdale Farms Incorporated in September of 1978. And it turns out that it was one of the first properties acquired by MDC with the sales tax funds. And they actually approached my father. He wasn't necessarily interested in selling the farm, but when somebody comes to you and offers you a deal, well, you take a look at it. So let's take a look back at Franklin Island from more than 200 years ago to the present day. In 2002, the University of Missouri Department of Geography created maps depicting the Missouri campsites of the 1804 Lewis and Clark expedition. On June 7th of 1804, the expedition camped on the north bank of the Missouri River at the mouth of the Bonfam Creek. And I didn't realize that until in 2004. You may recall that was the 200th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition. They had a group of reenactors that went all the way up the river, keelboats, pirogues, and at communities along the way, the groups and the different government agencies and volunteers and friends of Lewis and Clark, etc., stopped at various communities and did reenactment camps showing the local population how people lived during the Lewis and Clark days. So maybe you've been to Civil War reenactments, similar type of a venue. And they happened to stop at our property, which I'll describe a little bit later because we had a dock, not the Franklin Island dock. But anyway, they set up camp at our location, and they had these maps. And it was the first time that I realized that Lewis and Clark had actually camped at the mouth of the Bonfam Creek on what later was Franklin Island. And the river, this is how it was in 1815, where it's shown in blue, of course. And the current day Franklin Island is outlined in green. At that reenactment, that's a very good question. She asked if Franklin Island is still an island or just called that. And that's a great question, and I will describe that momentarily. But before I forget, again, this might take more than an hour, but I hope you're having as much fun as I am. At that reenactment in 2004, one of the group was a Clark, great, I don't know the generation, grandson of William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. I had the pleasure of meeting him, and I introduced myself and I said, in a way, we're kindred spirits. Your great-great-grandfather camped on a location that later became a farm owned by my family for 50 years. I still take great pleasure in thinking about that meeting with Mr. Clark. Well, 109 years after Lewis and Clark, this 1913 plat map of Howard County shows the area in the vicinity of Franklin Island. But there's no Franklin Island. The red indicates where Franklin Island is to this day. Even though the Missouri River Challenge meandered from year to year, and that was before the dikes and revetments and channelization was all built, it'd go bluff to bluff. Even though the river meandered, Franklin Island was surveyed by the U.S. government as Island number 21, 2,000 acres, more or less, sometime prior to this map of 1906. And as I mentioned, the red line shows the approximate location of present-day Island. Well, it's mystery to me why the 1939, 1913 map makers left the island off the map. And the only thing I can figure, it must have been underwater when they did their mapping. Perhaps those map makers in 1913 should have examined this 1892 Corps of Engineers map, which clearly shows Franklin Island. Back to my family. And I know that Doug and Abby will appreciate some of these pictures, as I hope all of you will. In this picture, from right to left, my grandfather, Ralphie Davis Sr., my father in the middle, Ralphie Davis Jr., and Ralph Willoughby. Now, Ralph Willoughby was a true cowboy from West Texas who came to work in Missouri for my dad in the 1950s, I suppose, and he worked there for 25 years. Now, my grandfather was a natural gas consulting engineer based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then later in Houston after World War II. He never lived in Missouri. But in 1928, he and his brother Sidney co-signed the note to buy Franklin Island so that their brother-in-law, Emil Thomas, Doug's father, would have a place to farm. Doug's father, if I have this right, and Florence, his wife, met at the University of Illinois, and Emil wanted to become a farmer. So my grandfather was already established in business. He said, go find a farm, I'll co-sign the note. So that's what brought my family to Howard County in the very first place. Well, then in 1941, 13 years later, while attending a friend's cattle sale in West Virginia, my grandfather got caught up in the excitement of the auction and bought a rail car load of cattle. And his oil and gas buddies sitting there said, hey, Ralph, where are you going to put your cattle? Well, Franklin Island really wasn't suitable for cattle. So because he had that connection to Howard and Cooper County, he made arrangements to buy a farm south of Boonville, and that's where the cattle were sent to. And that farm south of Boonville was the original Davisdale farm. Well, 1946, my grandfather moved his consulting business to Houston, and my parents, recently married, were living in a cabin next to a creek on Grasshopper Creek, Montana, near Bannock, Montana, which was one of the first gold strikes in Montana. My father worked in a gold mine there that was owned by his father. And my mother learned to cook on a wood stove. In the fall of 1946, as my parents were preparing to move to Houston so that my father could join my grandfather's business, my grandfather asked my father to stop off in Boonville, Missouri, to hire a new manager for that Cooper County farm where the cattle were. And my father probably had a vague idea of where Boonville, Missouri was. And for one reason, my parents were really Eastern city slickers growing up in Pittsburgh and Boston. But at my grandfather's request, they stopped in Boonville on their way to Houston. And my father fell in love with farming, and they decided to stay. They never moved to Houston. And over the next 25 years, Davisdale Farms grew to 10,000 acres in north central Missouri, from as far north as Macon, Salisbury, down to Windsor, Missouri. Pretty well spread out. Sorry about the background from my breathing. Keep doing that. Just don't turn blue. And again, any questions, please stop me. Question is, do I think my grandfather was hoping that they would like it to stay when they arrived in Boonville? Another good question. My grandfather, he was a brilliant man, but he was hard to get along with. My mother was always very intimidated by him. My dad and my grandfather were good business partners, but my mother was intimidated. The story goes that whenever my grandfather would come to Boonville, my mother would cry for 2 days in anticipation. So, to answer your question, I imagine, again, she grew up in Boston, never spent much time on a farm. When my dad said, let's settle in Boonville, Missouri, she said, okay, let's do that. I don't think she was anxious to move to Houston. Yeah. All right. Now we're going to look at the island back in 1947. Before the Missouri River was channelized, Franklin Island truly was an island. When this April 1947 aerial photograph of the island was taken, and that's the Missouri River over there, this would be the Bonfim Creek, and there is the island. When this picture was taken, the river stage was only about 1.5 feet over flood stage at that time. So again, those days the river would meander from bluff to bluff. Not so much in my lifetime, but obviously in the times of Lewis and Clark it had. Prior to the early 1960s, anytime that the river level reached 16 feet, which is still 5 feet below flood stage, which is 21 feet at Boonville gauge. When it would reach 16 feet, the only access was over a concrete low water crossing. Otherwise, you had to go in by boat. So you can imagine farming a 1,300-acre farm going in by boat. During high water, Fred Snoddy, owner of the old Snoddy store. Anybody else besides Tim and Linda familiar with Snoddy store? So Fred Snoddy kept a little tail dragger airplane at the old Snoddy airport just north of the old store. And my dad told stories that during high water, Fred Snoddy would deliver groceries by airplane to the handful of residents that were living on Franklin Island. Well, sometime in the 1940s, the mining operation in Montana, which was basically a dredging operation, dredging the streams for gold, that business was winding down. It never was much of a business to begin with, but it was winding down. So my grandfather arranged to put maybe drag lines and bulldozers and dirt movers. So he had to have them moved from Bannock, Virginia City area to Fort Benton, I suppose, which is 150 miles. But he loaded them on barges and brought them down the Missouri River to Boonville to begin building flood protection levees around the island. And of course, that's the days before the dams and reservoirs. Fort Benton was still the head of navigation, so you could put things on a barge and go all the way down to Boonville. Well, by the 1950s, corn and alfalfa were being raised on Franklin Island. So here during the 1950s, we got 1 row, 2 row shellers, and really, maybe 3 row sheller there. Oh, how that equipment has changed. And look at this. We did some irrigation with these irrigation pipes that you would tow across the field, move from set to set. And the shorter person there, I'm going to mention him in a moment. But in addition to the farming, for about 25 years, Franklin Island was home to 1,000-head cattle feedlot. We fed cattle out, steers and heifers. And there are some of the working pens adjacent to the feedlots. In this 1960 aerial photo, you can see the cattle pens and the large horizontal pit silo in which 5,000 tons of corn silage was stored every year. And the silo covered about a half acre. And that is these walls right here. So with 1,000 head of cattle, and here's the feedlot pens, it took a lot of corn silage to keep them fed. Now, the fact that Franklin Island was subject to frequent flooding as the levees were being improved, it often created logistical challenges. During the 1947 Missouri River flood, which at that time was the largest flood on the Missouri River at Boonville since the big flood of 1844, so 100 years later, to evacuate the cattle, a temporary holding pen was erected on a local sand barge, and cattle from the Franklin Island feedlot were evacuated and delivered by barge to tractor trailers backed across the flooded railroad tracks on the Boonville waterfront. Now, fast forward to 1974. Here's a picture of a new center pivot irrigation system being installed on Franklin Island. By the time Franklin Island was sold to the Conservation Department 4 years later, 640 acres were under center pivot irrigation. And Doug, that is Gertrude Davis Lynch Scott, my father's youngest of 3 sisters. I'm sure you remember her. She was there for a visit to see how Ralph was doing with the family farm. So just by comparison, looking back to the 1950s, how we irrigated then to 1974. Well, we got to keep talking about floods. The 10th biggest Missouri River flood to date struck in April of 1973, when 12 inches of rain fell in the Boonville area in 24 hours. This aerial photo shows much of Franklin Island underwater and the access road right here partially submerged. And this was the road that when I was a teenager, it was just a low water crossing. So anytime the river would get up, you'd have to go in by boat. When this flood struck, my dad and I were working in California. We had another mining operation going on. And he gets a call on the motel phone, and he gets off the phone. He says, I got to go, because this flood was breaking loose. And he traveled all night by airplane to get to Boonville to help with this flooding situation. Because it was feared, let me see if I'm right. Okay. Because it was feared that the feedlot would flood, okay, here's those feedlots that we looked at earlier. Okay, the river's coming up, getting ready to flood the island here. Because it was feared that the feedlot would flood, men worked through the night of Saturday, April 22nd, during constant thunderstorms, evacuating 600 head of cattle from the island. The cattle were herded onto the levee and driven about 1.5 miles to the north end of the Missouri River Highway Bridge into holding pens that had been hastily erected. Not a very good picture, this is from the newspaper, but there's a cattle coming up the levee to the holding pens. and tractor trailers were backed across the bridge from Boonville to load the cattle to take them to higher ground. By the time the cattle started walking up the levee from the feedlot, floodwaters were on both sides of the levee, leaving only a narrow path, maybe 12 feet wide, for the cattle to follow. And amazingly, only one head of cattle was lost that night, mired down in the mud. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. He said, can you read that quote? Them's Texas cattle. They're mean and they've never seen anything like this, Davis said. A little journalistic imagination there. My dad went to Princeton University and Cornell University. My mother, a Cornell University graduate, was an English major. And by gosh, she never let us use grammar like that. But it helps sell newspapers for sure. Okay, let's get away from floods for a little bit. Because as you can imagine, the Missouri River, I'm only 39 years old, but the Missouri River made an old man of me, as you'll see a little bit later. Well, here we are in 1985. So this would be 7 years after the department took ownership of the island. The feedlot pens, irrigation systems, and all the buildings have been removed. All that's left of that pit silo is the concrete floor. It's still there, no reason to get rid of that. Gravel has been applied. There are levees that go all the way around the island to keep the floodwaters out. Gravel has been applied to the tops of the levees to provide public access to the parking lots on the area. And for those of you who were involved with the Franklin Island cleanup or go to Franklin Island, there is the boat ramp at Franklin Island that was built, I suppose, in the 1980s. And when they built that ramp, as you can see, it basically, here's the flow of the river, and this is the main channel, the channel side of the river. The boat ramp is pretty well pointing right out into the river. And when they built that ramp, we're going, wow, that's going to be hard to launch boats under certain conditions. And I suppose the reason they did it that way was so that when the river would come up and go down, there'd be a scouring effect or clean off the ramp so you wouldn't have to go down there and shovel the mud off. But it's a wonderful access point, and it's the only public access point on the river for many miles in any direction. What's that? Especially upstream. Yeah, as you get downstream, there are lots of boat ramps. Well, this 1995 photo is interesting because it shows the remnants of the slough on the island's north side. A slough is basically, in Missouri vernacular, a body of water which is like a creek that, in this case, helped form the island. Sorry, I don't have a pointer, but back in the day when it was an island, I'm sorry. Yeah, back in the day, this point here, you can still see the remnants of trees there. That was where the water came in and went around the island and joined Bonfim Creek over here. This was the old slough, making it an island. Well, yes. I sure will. Okay, Roachport would be downstream about 7 or 8, 10 miles. Uh, Maybe you saw this screen earlier of Boonville relative to so Boonville, Roachport's 12 or so miles. Yeah. So if that answers your question. The question was, where is Roachport relative to this? Yes, David. Mile and a half, yeah. Yeah. And I'm sorry I didn't give good orientation earlier. I apologize. Well, not only is that slough no longer there, but for those of you who've been into Franklin Island, here is the entrance road going over the levee into Franklin Island. And these trees is basically in the area where the old slough was. So you drive in there now, you cannot tell that it ever was an island. My dad got together with local farmers to improve the levee from the highway bridge down to Franklin Island in about 1970 because it benefited all the farmers to cut off that slough. If you were to try to get a permit from the Corps of Engineers today to do that, it probably would not happen. But 1970, things were a lot different then. So the old slough dried up and the island ceased being an island. An island no more. This was the old slough area that I was mentioning in the last slide. So this map shows the current configuration of Franklin Island Conservation Area. And one of the reasons I wanted to show this slide is that one of the interesting family stories for me is that, again, I mentioned that the Conservation Department came to my dad, said, we'd like to buy Franklin Island. After they agreed to purchase the island, the price was agreed upon. After all that, MDC discovered that Davisdale Farms owned the island, but did not own the 3/4 mile access road from Highway 40 to Franklin Island. There's the road. There's Highway 40. That road comes in. Well, they said, we can't buy a property that only has an easement to it. You got to buy that road or the deal is off. Furthermore, if you buy that road, we're not putting any more money into the deal. This is the price. Well, my dad had to go to the neighbors. They were good friends until money was involved. And he negotiated with them. And of course, they knew what was going on. They knew that he had to buy that or the deal was off. So my dad didn't want to lose the deal over 2 acres, as it turned out to be. So he negotiated with the neighbors, surveyed every curve of that road, purchased it, and deeded it to the Department of Conservation along with the island. The deal happened. The reason I mention this story is the purchase price of the road. Again, this is 1978. The purchase price of the road was about $25,000 per acre. Undoubtedly the highest price ever paid for a gravel road in Howard County until that time. Had to happen. Well, switching gears for a little bit, I want to share a few stories with you about Davisdale Conservation Area. So 4 years later, in May of 1982, the Conservation Department again approached my dad and said, we're interested in buying this property, which was 24 acres of upland pasture, excuse me. The department was interested in this property because it consisted of one large contiguous tract of land, including over 800 acres of River Hills woodland. And the black line represents the perimeter of the farm. And interestingly, we never owned this piece of ground in the middle of it. And to this day, I suppose it's still privately owned. Now, going back a little bit in history, Davisdale started buying farms in this area in the mid-1950s. Farms ranging in size from 50 to 300 acres. And of course, in those days, most farms were that size. Small tracts of land farmed by a family or two. This 1913 map, you can't really see the detail, but it shows the perimeter of Davisdale. And on this map, it shows, among other things, Country School number 13. It shows a voting booth, and they're highlighted on the map. And a couple of mining operations, which probably were coal seams dug in the side of the hill. Well, here's a 1957 aerial photograph of the northeast part of the farm. Shows areas of soil erosion caused by years of small truck farm operations. And over the years, after Davisdale acquired these lands, we terraced the land and planted fescue grass, which was very popular in the 50s and 60s. It's out of favor now, but in those days it was very popular for cattle grazing. So we terraced and planted fescue grass to make the land suitable for grazing. From the 1940s to the 1960s, Davisdale Farms raised registered Hereford cattle. In fact, the name Davisdale was created just for marketing purposes. It was a made-up name. It goes back to the Dales of England, but Davisdale was the name. And interestingly, Davisdale bulls of these registered Hereford cattle were shown at livestock shows in various cities, including Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, and Denver. The bulls often traveled to the shows in rail cars, again, back in the 50s and 60s, mostly the 50s. And the gentleman I showed you, the shorter man in the picture of the irrigation photo a moment ago, I said I'll mention him later. When he was a teenager, his name was Edgar Freeling. He worked for my family for, I think, about 50 years. When he was a teenager, he would ride in the rail cars with the bulls to Chicago, St. Louis, etc., tending to them during the trips. Well, this picture is my mother, Mary Davis, taken in March of 1947, 3 months before the birth of my older brother, Ralphie Davis III. Well, as late as 1982, the land that is now Davisdale Conservation Area was home to a 600-head cow-calf operation. And that property was just really ideal for raising hay. It was all well fenced, and we had 600 cow-calf operation. This corral, for those of you who have been there, was located at the north end of the Davisdale area in the vicinity of the present-day Conservation Department maintenance shop. And this 1974 picture shows that horses were used to work cattle in those days before four-wheelers, of course. And at times when we would move cattle from one pasture to another, and sometimes there were county roads involved because the farms that we used or grazed may not have been right with that Davisdale. Sometimes we would have as many as 10 men on horseback, 10 men and ladies. Some of them volunteers, just friends. They didn't all work for us. But we would move sometimes 200 to 300 head of cattle from one pasture to another. Oh, by the way, that fellow on the horseback there, that is yours truly. And by the length of my hair, you can probably guess that this picture was taken in the mid-1970s. In May and June of each year, we harvested and stored thousands of bales of fescue hay on Davisdale to be used in the winter for winter cattle feed at Davisdale for the cows and Franklin Island for the feedlot. In the years following the purchase of Davisdale, the conservation area has purchased adjoining farms, and the Davisdale Conservation Area now encompasses about 2,700 acres, featuring 23 ponds and lakes and miles of hiking trails. Lots of really interesting terrain there, wildlife, pasture, woods, hiking trails. The question was, is Davisdale suitable for bicycling? Not on the kind of bike that you'd have on the Katy Trail. Maybe mountain biking, I'm not sure. But I'm a long-time cross-country skier, over 50 years. And the reason I mention that is not recently, but I have parked with a friend a vehicle at the north end, and one vehicle there and one vehicle here, and cross-country skied all the way down through the farm. Lovely, lovely experience. Now, this three-story brick home, built in the early 1900s, was located on a hill, the river bluff we call it, on the south end of Davisdale, overlooking the river bottom. And it was located right about here in this vicinity. A beautiful view of the river bottom. That home was built by one of the early owners of that farm, probably a couple 100-acre farm, in the early 1900s. And Ralph Willoughby, the West Texas cowboy I mentioned earlier, he lived in this house until the late 1970s. Sometime in the 1950s, and not long after Ralph Willoughby had moved to Missouri from the high plains of West Texas, my dad asked him one day, he said, "Hey, Ralph, how you like Missouri? You know, you come from the high plains of West Texas where the wind always blows. How do you like Missouri?" Ralph thought a moment. He said, "Well, it's pretty nice. But every time you get ready to see something, a hill or a tree gets in the way." True story. So all that remains of that house is the stone foundation, because the department tore it down. There wasn't a good use for it, and it was not in very good condition. So they tore it down in the mid-1980s. All that remains is a stone foundation. You can still see it if you go up there. There are many ponds and lakes, hiking trails, and primitive camping areas. And the trails really aren't, to my memory, marked per se as trails. They're really primitive trails, but there's lots of trails through the woods. Some of them are wildlife trails, but a great area to hike. Fields and forest, and even a prehistoric Indian mound, which makes present-day Davisdale Conservation Area a wonderful place to spend an hour or a few days. There is the Indian mound. It's not a very good picture, but it was dug into by the university back, probably before my time in the 40s or 50s. And you can still see evidence of where it was partially excavated. They don't advertise it because obviously you don't want that disturbed, but I'm going to back up and show you the approximate location. It's fun to walk up there because it's a nice view overlooking the river. And that Indian mound would be maybe on this hill here, up in this area. It's at the south end. It'd be fun for those of you who are interested to walk up there and take a look sometime. Well, in the years since my family sold Davisdale to the Department of Conservation, I personally have hiked, fished, and cross-country skied on the area. And I especially enjoy the solitude, frequent encounters with wildlife, and the beauty of the surroundings. It makes me proud to live in Missouri, a state whose citizens recognize the benefit we all derive from the fulfillment of the purpose of the design for conservation, more places and opportunities for all to enjoy Missouri outdoors in more ways. So, switching gears a little bit, I'd like to spend the remainder of my time telling you a little bit about my knowledge of commercial navigation of the Missouri River, with emphasis on central Missouri and my family's 36-year involvement. As you probably know, commercial freight hauling on the Missouri River has been around for well over 2 centuries. Following the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, trade in the lower Missouri River Valley ballooned from, in present-day dollars, around $500,000 in 1797, quickly to $1.5 million or so in 1805. During the War of 1812, much of the Missouri River freight was shipped by flatboats and keelboats to fulfill military contracts, the cargoes consisting of salt, and probably from the salt mines of Howard and Saline counties, salt pork, beef, flour, whiskey, and tallow. In 1819, the Independence was the second steamboat to navigate up the Missouri River and the first to travel as far as Franklin, Missouri, which was right across from Boonville, landing after 13 days' travel from St. Louis with a cargo of whiskey, flour, and sugar. By 1833, 24 sidewheelers plied the Big Muddy, and compared to the 20 to 25-ton keelboats and flatboats of the earlier generation, those early Missouri River steamboats commonly carried between 1 to 300 tons of cargo. Tobacco was the first major cash crop in the area known as the Boonslick. It was shipped for over 2 decades in the 1830s and 40s by flatboat from Old Franklin to New Orleans. And then by 1835, the port of Glasgow, upriver from Boonville, around the bend and upriver about 15 miles north of Arrow Rock. By 1835, the port of Glasgow had developed into a well-known tobacco port. In 1841 alone, 25 boats docked at Glasgow over 300 times. driven by the vast increase in tobacco freight alone. Well, few boats traveled upriver from Glasgow until after 1840. Which helped the new town enjoy its status as a riverside destination and port for St. Louis investors. Glasgow Landing was a series of, in those days, of 7 steamboat landings, each with its own warehouse or industry. And it sat in the center of an arc of tobacco plantations from Keatsville to Salisbury to Huntsville and south to Fayette, which is east of Glasgow. The cash crop of tobacco, one of dozens of products transported on boats, along with wheat and hemp, became the largest dollar export shipped from the Boonslick. By 1851, fully 1/3 of Missouri's tobacco crop rolled across the docks at Glasgow. And by 1852, 15 steamboats visited Glasgow's port each week, and 58 steamboats operated on the Missouri River. 1852, 8 years before the Civil War. Well, steamboating on the Missouri River during the Civil War, as you can imagine, was a dangerous proposition because of the roving guerrilla bands that would regularly attack boats below Kansas City. But after the war, steamboat traffic on the lower Missouri picked up once again. Captain Joseph Kinney, he was the best known of the Boonslick steamboat men, came to Boonville nearly penniless from Indiana in 1844, the year of the great flood of that era. He entered the steamboat business in 1856 when he commissioned the building of a 200-foot by 400-ton side wheel packet boat that he called the W.H. Russell, which was named after his friend. You may be familiar with the name. Russell, in 1860, was one of the founders of the Pony Express. During the Civil War, Kinney built and operated at least 4 other boats, and he was one of the primary advocates of stern-wheeled boats on the Missouri River in the 1850s and 60s. He retained an active interest in steamboating down to the time of his death in 1892. But in 1869, when River Scene, his mansion on the North River bank across from Boonville, was completed, and he was approaching his 60th birthday, Kinney left the river and concentrated on the managing of his steamboat business and other merchandising businesses up and down the river from Boonville. So many of you might be familiar with River Scene. It's still it's a private residence, again, right across the river from Boonville, built in 1869. And an interesting story about that is that when he was getting ready to build this mansion, the story goes that his friend said, "You're crazy to build at that location. It's going to flood." Well, what Kinney knew, because he knew the river so well, was that that was on the highest river bottom piece of ground for miles and miles and miles. And so he built it, and it hardly ever flooded. In the flood of 1993, which was a 500-year flood, it got up to about mid-level on the door on the first floor. But that was really, I think, the first time it had flooded since he built it in 1869. So he knew what he was doing. Well, by the end of the Civil War, the expansion of railroads was beginning to have a significant impact on the economics of steamboating. Despite a brief resurgence of steamboat activity in the early 1870s, It was becoming clear by the 1880s that the days of steamboats were numbered. And by the 1890s, there were very few steamboats operating successfully on either the lower or upper Missouri River. But with the revival of Missouri River transportation 50 years, 60 years later in the 1930s, Boone's Lick area residents once more began making names for themselves on the river. I know Tim and Linda are probably familiar with this name, Wesley Wolt, W-O-H-L-T, of Hermann, Missouri, worked on the river for more than 50 years, beginning in the early 1900s with his father, Gustav Wolt. They operated boats like the Robert C. McGregor, the William S. Mitchell, and a couple of those became dredges later on, and the Bixby, up and down the Missouri River throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And in those days, boats were being built at Gasconade, Missouri, down in the vicinity of the mouth of the Osage, Gasconade River. Lots of riverboats were built in that location. Well, interestingly, and Tim can relate to this, Captain Wolt was the man who, in retirement in the 1960s, piloted the Lewis and Clark keelboat replica at Boone Cave Landing, right below downstream from Rocheport. 1 hour rides along the bluffs near Rocheport cost 25 cents. And I had to put this picture in because I had the pleasure of serving as deckhand on the Discovery when I was a teenager, between my junior and senior years in high school. My hair is a little bit shorter then. And here is Captain Wolt right there. Now, of course, this is a Coast Guard approved vessel, steel hull, planking to make it look like a keel boat, had a 1 or 2 Detroit diesel engines for power. We didn't use the sails, that was just for show. But we'd take people for rides up and down the river. And Tim, you were a tour guide, were you not, at the Boone Cave? So we were all teenagers. Other friends worked there too. Boy, did we have a wonderful summer. And this boat was just obviously a tourist attraction. We got invited to take that boat down to St. Louis for the 4th of July celebration that year. And I had the pleasure of accompanying Captain Wolt down to St. Louis. It was like Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn sailing down the river, tying off the riverbank at Hermann for the night and fighting the mosquitoes. We got to St. Louis and they had us tie off at the foot of the arch on the landing. We were a centerpiece attraction for the 4th of July weekend. And Tim, Chief Red Fox, who was 100 years old or so he said, he was another attraction at the Boone Cave area. And what he smoked, a dozen cigars a day. And at any rate, they brought him down to St. Louis, and he would be on the boat welcoming the tourists. It was a fun summer. Okay. How many days did it take to get back upstream? You know, it just took one, good question, how many days to get downstream? It just took one night downstream, and then probably took 3 or 4 days to come back upstream. I don't really recall. I just remember tying off at Hermann and it being like 100 degrees. And of course, there's no air conditioning on the boat, you know. But when we got to St. Louis, they put us up in a hotel right at the riverfront. And I'll never forget walking into that hotel room and still have my sea legs, so to speak. I had a hard time getting used to standing still in a hotel room. Well, the Flood Control Act of 1944 authorized the Pick-Sloan Plan, resulting in the construction of 5 main stem dams on the Missouri River. Well, the purpose of the act was to help control flooding on the Missouri River, and the large reservoirs of the main stem system help provide a dependable flow to maintain the navigation channel. In 1945, the Army Corps of Engineers began the Missouri River Stabilization and Navigation Project, which would permanently increase the river's navigation channel to a width of 300 feet and a depth of 9-foot channel. During the work that continues to this day, the 735-mile navigation channel from Sioux City to St. Louis has been controlled with some modifications by building rock dikes to direct the river's flow and scour out the sediments. Well, back to my family's involvement with the Missouri River. In 1971, my father and 2 partners incorporated Interstate Marine Terminals, located, also known as IMT, located right across the river from Boonville. The intention was to build a fertilizer barge handling facility on the north bank of the Missouri River. Well, my father, by this time, had been selling fertilizer in mid-Missouri since the early 1950s, and he recognized that the savings in barge freight cost compared to truck or rail would justify the investment in a facility of this sort. Well, he was further encouraged by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers prediction made in the 1960s that Missouri River freight would increase to 12 million tons by barge by the year 2000, which never happened. Well, my dad and this company, IMT, purchased 25 acres of farmland, later expanded to 41 acres. And here's the old Boonville Bridge, and there's the north bank of the Missouri River. This is the facility. They constructed a steel H-pile barge holding dock in the river, a 100,000-pound truck scale for semi-tractor trailers, 2 1.5 million gallon storage tanks for liquid fertilizer, and a 1,300-foot long pipeline connecting the dock to the tanks. And right here, this line, you can see one of the pipelines going from the tanks down to the dock. Well, I moved back to Boonville from Colorado and joined my father in business in the spring of 1974 when I was about to turn 25 years old. Well, over the next 15 years, we partnered with the Howard Cooper Regional Port Authority to build an additional sheet pile dock for handling dry cargo barges. Here's the first dock, just a simple H-pile cluster for holding liquid fertilizer barges and then molasses later on. And we built this dock, a sheet pile dock, in the early 1980s. We built additional liquid storage tanks, fertilizer warehouses, and this is one of the fertilizer warehouses under construction. In the early 1980s, IMT was the only multi-cargo barge facility on the Missouri River between St. Louis and Kansas City, handling liquid and dry fertilizer, cattle feed molasses, ice control salt, and grain. And then in 1999, when the Isle of Capri Casino in Boonville was under construction, this being on the Boonville side, the south side of the river, IMT installed a rail car unloading system at the newly constructed team track adjacent to the Union Pacific Railroad. This expansion allowed us to unload as many as 400 rail cars, 40,000 tons of fertilizer per year. in the years prior to the Great Flood of 1993. And IMT handled as much as 100,000 tons of cargo per year through the facility, distributing feed and fertilizer to dealers throughout the state of Missouri. Most of the fertilizer, molasses, and salt that arrived by barge into the port originated in chemical plants and mines along the Gulf Coast from as far away as Russia, and sugarcane plantations in Central America for the molasses, and was transferred in New Orleans to barges for the 1,500-mile journey up the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. 2 jumbo liquid fertilizer barges transporting 5,000 tons valued as much as $750,000 would often arrive in the middle of the night for discharge into our tanks. The towboat would stand by, and when they'd arrive, we'd hook up the hose and pump until the barges were empty. The towboat stood by while the barges were being unloaded, requiring us to operate 24 hours a day. Well, on a couple of occasions, we hosted visits at our dock by passenger vessels. The Kansas City-based Missouri River Queen, which was a dinner cruise paddle wheeler. They stayed at our dock for a couple of days. It was wintertime, and they took folks out for a dinner cruise in the ice. Yeah. Yeah. And also, we hosted the New Orleans-based River Explorer, a 200-passenger hotel excursion barge. And these folks took a couple of those jumbo liquid tanker barges that were just basically a deck barge on top with the cargo, underneath, and they built a hotel. And of course, the 2 barges are joined together, so it was a floating Missouri River cruise ship, so to speak. And they made trips from St. Louis all the way up to, I think, Platte City, north of Kansas City, where they turned for the return trip. It was fun having them visit our facility. That was called the River Explorer. Yeah. And that would have been in 1980s, something like that. Yeah. Well, also, this is the location where, when the Lewis and Clark reenactment expedition came up the river, we hosted them at our facility. Well, my first 19 years at IMT involved lots of hard work and some sleepless nights, but I was really having fun expanding the business. Then, in July of 1993, the fun went out of it. When the Great Flood of 93, which happened to be a 500-year expected flood, hit the Midwest, stalled weather systems over the upper Midwest delivered record rains to most of the Missouri and Mississippi River Basin states. Before the rains began that year, the upper Missouri River main stem reservoirs were in drought. They were so low, in fact, a 6-year drought in the upper basin, that the Corps of Engineers predicted that it would take several years of normal rainfall to refill the reservoirs. But as it turned out, the reservoirs filled in about 2 months. And record releases from the dams contributed to the massive downstream flooding that followed. And you probably saw a lot in the news. St. Louis, they have CBS and all were hosting from St. Louis. The Mississippi was a disaster, but so was the Missouri River. And entire state of Iowa that year of 1993, every county was declared a disaster area. Every single county of Iowa. Again, I'm only 39 years old, but the river made an old man of me. The normal width of the river at Boonville is about a 1/4 mile wide. There's a tree line on the north side. Okay, quarter mile there. At the height of the flood of 93, the river was bluff to bluff, New Franklin to Boonville, a distance of 2.5 miles. The flood crest at Boonville in 93 exceeded the previous record in 1844 by nearly 5 feet. And at one point, some of you recall that the I-70 bridge at Rocheport was down to 2 lanes. 2 of the other lanes were flooded. And the Rocheport Bridge was the only open bridge between Kansas City and St. Louis for a period of time. In fact, if we'd had another foot of water, Rocheport Bridge would have completely flooded, and northern Missouri River would have been totally cut off from the south, and you would have had to go by boat or plane or Kansas City, St. Louis. You had a question, sir? Okay, thank you for asking where the terminal is. Yeah. Yeah. You remember the picture earlier of the fertilizer? This is the new bridge is right next to the, here's Boonville. Here's the railroad. Yeah, there's the railroad bridge. That's the bridge that was replaced in the early 1990s. And you remember the fertilizer warehouse I showed you under construction in the earlier slide? Steve, you're taller. It's that Quonset shaped building there. Yeah.
So the docks would have been
Yeah. 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 Down here. No, here. Here. No, yeah, yeah. And you can just barely see the top of the levee there. Yeah. Yeah. Of course. Old Franklin, yeah. Old Franklin was upstream. Yes. Basically, that is right. So Old Franklin, right across from Boonville, west upstream a couple of miles, was one of the early settlements along the Missouri River. In fact, the first newspaper west of St. Louis in the country was published at Old Franklin. Kit Carson was a saddle shop apprentice that ran away to go west. The Santa Fe Trail originated at Franklin, Missouri in 1821, the first expedition to Santa Fe from Franklin. A lot of history there. But it was built right on the riverbank. And by 1829 or so, it was washed away by the recurring floods. And they moved the town up on the bluff to New Franklin. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay, this group of trees right there, it's in there. Yeah. Yeah, that's River Scene. I should have worn my Ron DeSantis boots. Yes. She just said that there's an exhibit at the Historical Society of Boone County that has an exhibit on the 93 flood. It'll be there till when? Right. Wonderful. That'd be fun to see. I encourage everyone to join us there. Any other questions before I go on? So in addition to the many homes and businesses in the Howard County floodplain that were damaged or destroyed, IMT was inundated by floodwater 16 feet deep in our facility. Our office was destroyed. Our feed plant, tanks, and warehouses were filled with mud. One of the 1.5 gallon tanks, which we had flooded, it was empty. We flooded it with water to try to keep it from floating. After the flood, we discovered that it actually lifted like a boat because the water didn't come in fast enough, so it was buoyant. And it lifted and later settled down, causing another massive problem. Once the water receded, large work release crews from the Boonville State Prison spent weeks shoveling mud out of the tanks and warehouses. Our facility was shut down for 3 months, and the return to normal business took about a year. Okay, a little bit of levity here. The only bit of levity that Debbie and I experienced during the entire nightmare of the 93 flood happened one day during the cleanup. Our son, Andrew, who is now 33 years old, was 3 years old at the time. Even though he was quite young, he had accompanied his grandpa, Debbie's father, who was a prairie home farmer. So Andrew would tag along to the hardware store, to the feed store, the supply store, ride on the tractor, etc. And he also accompanied us walking across the bridge to stare at the floodwaters as it was appeared that our business was going to be destroyed. Well, Andrew, having heard us talking about everything being washed down the river, one day he climbed up in my lap and tugged at my shirt collar and in a soothing manner asked, Daddy, did your office go down the river to New Orleans? If you're from out of state, Orleans is a farm supply store. Okay. Yeah, okay. Right. Well, just 2 years after the flood of 93, in 1995, we experienced a 100-year flood on the Missouri River, the second highest river level at that time. Well, fortunately, following the 93 flood, with money that I borrowed from the SBA, the Disaster Assistance Loan, I purchased adjoining land and built a secondary levee around the terminal. And although the floodwaters surrounded IMT on all sides, IMT did not flood that year. The new levee kept the terminal from flooding twice in 3 years. I'll never forget, you had water all the way around, and I had product in the buildings and tanks at that point. And I'd go into the property, and you could walk across the ground, and it would squish like you were on just a mud swamp. But fortunately, the levees held. Well, in the years following the 93 flood, we rebuilt the business with the help of a SBA disaster assistance loan. Well, we turned down the opportunity to sell the business to the federal government in the buyout program, which was enacted at that time, because we didn't want to take money that could be put to better use buying out people who had lost their homes. But in our hearts, my wife Debbie and I knew that we could not continue to live this way always worrying about when the next flood would hit, one that might wipe us out entirely. So the good news is we sold the business to ConAgra Foods in 2007. And Gavilon Fertilizer, which is a spinoff from ConAgra, continues to operate the facility to this day. Well, the tonnage of goods shipped by barges on the Missouri River saw a serious decline in tonnage from the 1960s to the present day. As I mentioned earlier, in the 60s, the Corps said the tonnage is going to increase to 12 million tons per year by the year 2000. But the opposite actually happened. The amount of goods never exceeded 3 million tons, and by 2006 had decreased to just 200,000 tons for a number of reasons. The river is only navigable 7 or 8 months a year because not enough water is available to be released from the reservoirs. And because it's a short season, the towboat operators have a hard time making money on the Missouri River. So the freight advantage never really was what the Corps anticipated. Well, some good news is that by 2020, tonnage on the river, this is other than rock, sand, and gravel, which is local, had rebounded to about 1 million tons per year. But by comparison, barge traffic on the Mississippi River is about 300 million tons annually. So the volume on the Mississippi River is 300 times the Missouri River. Well, I'm going to close by saying that Franklin Island, Davisdale, and Interstate Marine Terminals, 3 properties that have played major roles in our lives, I'm very grateful for that. It's been a privilege to know and work with the many men and women who shaped and built those properties in the 79 years that my family was involved. Well, as you can imagine, my perspective, I've been retired for a number of years now, and I've been away from the river business for 25 years. My perspective on the Missouri River has changed in the years since we sold the properties. These days, I enjoy my time on the river, kayaking in river reliefs, Race to the Dome, participating in Missouri River relief cleanups, and this was the Franklin Island cleanup a few years ago. What's that? No, I just showing which way to go. You know they keep me way away from. I'm a snowplow driver, not a boat driver. I also enjoy on occasion passing the feather around the campfire with my Missouri River Relief friends. And waking up on the riverbank to enjoy another beautiful sunrise on the Missouri River. I want to thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any additional questions that you have.
Well, we know that it has been a long presentation, and some folks will be leaving, but I know a bunch of you'll stay for questions, and that's all good. It's all good. Did you have a question in the back? So let me find you back there. Oh, awesome.
Okay, so you said you've been away from like navigation issues for 25 years, but maybe you can answer this anyway. So they're planning to build a new port in Jefferson City, one or two. Do you think that'll increase future navigation numbers?
Well, not only are they doing some improvements in Jefferson City, but I mentioned earlier the Howard County Port Authority, which is still involved over at IMT, they get funding from the state of Missouri, and they made improvements to that dock in Boonville a couple of years ago. They built it higher, and they're shipping, to my understanding, they're shipping grain out of there, some rock. But in my personal opinion, because of the freight cost disadvantage, that to me, it's very unlikely that it's ever going to grow much more than maybe 1 or 2 million tons a year. That's just my personal opinion.
Is that New Haven?
New Haven or Washington? New Haven, yeah. Yes, sir.
I had a question about your family's intent with the sale to the conservation department. Were they interested from like a conservation standpoint to get that land open up for people to visit, or was it kind of just an opportunity since they came and approached your family about it?
That's a good question. For those who might not have heard it, his question was the sale of those properties by my family to the Department of Conservation was part of our motive to make the land available for public use and conservation, or was it just because it was an opportunity to sell a farm? There's two answers to your question. My family was very conservation minded. My dad and my family, we were hunters and fishermen. We enjoyed sharing the property with people. We liked the idea of developing lands for public use. My dad was part of a family corporation. He had 3 sisters. So he was just a 25% interest in the Davisdale farms. The 3 sisters lived elsewhere in the country, and they were always somewhat frustrated about profits being put back into the expansion of the business. So when my dad was in his early 50s, as it turns out, they were encouraging him to let's get out of the farming business so we can have maybe some fun, enjoy maybe a little bit of money. So they were really putting pressure on him to sell the farms. And it just was serendipity, just a wonderful coincidence that the department came along and offered to buy. But as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, we're delighted that it's being shared by the public. I can't personally think of a better use for it. Tim. There's a microphone, Tim.
The 8-cent sales tax, after it was originally used for the intended purpose, that continues, and that's what the department uses to buy more land. And for instance, this would be a good example, and I imagine that's where that money came from. But they have bought more land all over the state.
Yeah, they sure have. In fact, when they the question was, has the department bought more land? When they started buying land with the sales tax, let me look up that statistic. When they started buying land with the sales tax money, they owned about 200,000 acres. They bought 500,000 acres since then. So huge expansion of owned land. But then, of course, they manage another 400,000+ acres. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yes.
They sure do. Yeah, the terrific magazine she mentions, the Missouri Conservationist, and it's free to anyone who just gets on their mailing list. Well, I want to apologize. I promised this would be like 45 minutes to an hour. Debbie said I should get the hook. Well, thank you for your attention. I hope it's been enjoyable for you.